Either you clean that toilet, or you don't work here anymore. The sentence didn't echo. It cut, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the polished quiet of the corporate lobby as if it belonged there, as if humiliation was part of the building's design, and every head turned at once, drawn not by the words themselves, but by the certainty behind them, the kind of certainty that comes from power never questioned, never challenged, and right there in the center of it stood Ethan Cole, hands relaxed at his sides, dressed in a plain black hoodie, dark jeans, and worn sneakers, looking nothing like the man whose signature had finalized the acquisition of this entire company less than 48 hours ago. And that was exactly the point, because Ethan didn't walk in to be recognized. He walked in to observe, to see what happened when no one thought he mattered. And now he had his answer, loud and clear, delivered by Daniel Whitman, operations manager, mid-40s, pressed suit, polished shoes, and a confidence built entirely on assumptions, standing just 10 feet away with a pair of latex gloves pinched between his fingers like they were a test, not a tool. While a few employees nearby exchanged glances, some amused, some uncomfortable, but none stepping in, because silence in rooms like this wasn't accidental, it was trained, and Ethan saw all of it without reacting, without flinching, his gaze steady, almost detached, like a man watching a scene he'd lived through before. Because he had, years ago, standing outside a high-rise in Chicago. At 22, portfolio in hand, being told by security that deliveries went through the back, that people who looked like him didn't walk through front doors like this, and the memory didn't rise like anger, it settled like clarity. Because this wasn't new, it was just dressed differently now, wearing suits instead of uniforms, hiding behind policies instead of signs, and Daniel stepped closer, impatience tightening his voice. "I'm not repeating myself," he said, louder this time for the room, for the audience that had quietly formed, for the phones beginning to lift just slightly higher, because something about this moment felt worth capturing, like a spectacle unfolding in real time. And still Ethan didn't move, didn't bend to pick up the gloves now resting at his feet, didn't offer an explanation or a defense. He simply looked past Daniel for half a second, toward the hallway where the restroom door sat slightly ajar, fluorescent lights spilling out onto the carpet, and then back again, his expression unchanged, calm in a way that didn't fit the situation, calm in a way that made one or two people shift there. Wait without realizing why, because real power rarely announces itself. It waits, it measures, it lets the room reveal itself completely before it speaks. And when Ethan finally did move, it wasn't toward the hallway, it wasn't toward the gloves, it was toward his pocket, slow, deliberate, every motion controlled, as he pulled out his phone and unlocked it with a single tap. The faint glow lighting his face just enough for the closest observer to notice something different, something that didn't match the role they had already assigned him. And Daniel let out a short laugh, dismissive, confident, still unaware that the ground beneath him had already begun to shift, because the man he had just tried to reduce to a task, to a label, to a stereotype, wasn't there to clean anything. He was there to decide who stayed, who left, and what this place would become next. And as Ethan raised the phone to his ear, his voice low, steady, almost quiet enough to miss if you weren't paying attention, he said, "Get me the executive team." And for the first time since the words had been spoken, since the command had been thrown across the room like it was law, the air didn't feel controlled anymore. It felt uncertain, like something unseen had just entered the room, and it wasn't leaving anytime soon. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured slowly, like glass under pressure, beginning at the edges of the room, where whispers formed and eyes shifted, because something about the way Ethan stood there did not match the role they had already written for him. And Daniel felt it even if he did not understand it, his jaw tightening as he crossed his arms, trying to reassert control. Over a moment that was slipping through his fingers, "Who exactly are you calling?" he asked, the confidence still there but thinner now, stretched, while Ethan did not answer him, not directly, his attention already elsewhere, his voice steady into the phone. "Yes, this is Ethan. I am on site. I need full executive presence on call immediately, legal included." And the name landed differently than it should have, subtle but heavy, like a word that meant something more if you knew where to place it. And a few employees exchanged looks, one of them pulling out their phone not to record this time but to search, Because curiosity had replaced amusement, and that shift was everything. Because once people start questioning the narrative, it begins to fall apart. And Daniel let out a short breath, almost a scoff, stepping closer again as if proximity could restore authority. "You think dropping a first name is going to change anything?" he said, louder now, pulling the room back toward him, toward the version of events he preferred, where he was still in charge, where this was still just a janitor refusing instructions. And Ethan lowered the phone slightly, not ending the call, just pausing, his eyes meeting Daniel's for the first time with something sharper behind them. Not anger, not even frustration, just clarity, the kind that makes other people uncomfortable without knowing why. And in the background, a quiet voice spoke through the phone, crisp, professional. "We are all here, Mr. Cole. The board is listening." And Ethan gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, before speaking again, not to Daniel, not to the room, but to the system that had already begun moving. "Good. I want you to log this entire interaction from the moment I walked in, every instruction, every witness, every camera angle available." And now the shift was visible, undeniable. Because people stopped pretending this was nothing, stopped pretending this was normal, and Olivia Brooks, the intern, who had been watching from the reception desk, felt it first, that quiet realization settling in her chest as she looked from Ethan to Daniel and back again, her voice barely above a whisper as she said to no one in particular, "Wait, Cole?" And Daniel heard it, turned toward her sharply. "Stay out of this," he snapped. But it was too late, because the name had already landed, already begun to ripple through the room, and Ethan stepped forward just once, closing the distance by a single step that felt larger than it was, his voice still even, still controlled, but now carrying a weight that had not been there before. "You gave an order," he said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact, without asking a single question. And Daniel opened his mouth to respond, to defend, to justify, but the words did not come as easily this time, because the room was no longer on his side, not fully, not anymore. And somewhere behind them a notification sound echoed softly from someone's phone, then another, and another, like a quiet signal spreading through the space. Because information moves fast when it is real, and faster when it threatens to change everything. And Ethan lifted the phone back to his ear, his tone unchanged. "Prepare to revoke all mid-level management access pending review," he said, as if he were discussing numbers, not people, as if this had already been decided. And Daniel's confidence finally cracked, just slightly, just enough to show, because for the first time since this began, he was no longer certain who was standing in front of him, and that uncertainty was louder than anything Ethan had said so far. The room did not erupt, it tightened, like something invisible had wrapped around every conversation and pulled it still, because now the weight of what was happening was beginning to settle in, not fully understood but impossible to ignore. And Daniel felt it in the way no one laughed anymore, in the way even the smallest movements seemed louder than they should have been, a chair shifting, a shoe scraping against the floor, the faint hum of the overhead lights, all of it pressing in as if the building itself was waiting for something to be said that would change everything. And Ethan stood in the center of it without raising his voice, without demanding attention, yet somehow holding all of it anyway, his phone still at his ear as he listened for a brief second before speaking again. "I want full access logs from the last 90 days pulled and reviewed," he said calmly, like he was reading from a checklist that had already been written long before this moment. And on the other end a voice responded instantly, efficient, prepared, "Already in progress, Mr. Cole. Compliance has been alerted." And that was when Olivia stepped forward just a little, not enough to interrupt, but enough to be seen, her eyes fixed on Ethan with a growing certainty that was turning into realization, because she had seen that name before, not in passing, not casually, but on the internal onboarding documents that had circulated just days ago, the ones no one had really paid attention to, the ones that mentioned a new ownership structure, a new executive authority, a name at the top that most people assumed they would never meet. And now that name was standing 10 feet away wearing a hoodie and being told to clean a restroom, and her voice came out before she could stop it, quiet but clear. "You are him." And the words landed differently than anything else that had been said, because they were not a challenge, they were a confirmation. And Daniel turned toward her again, sharper this time. But there was hesitation now, a flicker of doubt breaking through his control. Enough, he said, but it did not carry the same weight. Not anymore. And Ethan finally lowered the phone completely, ending the call with a single tap that sounded louder than it should have, as if it marked a transition the room could not undo. And when he looked at Daniel again, it was not with anger or satisfaction. It was with something far more final, like a conclusion already reached. You trained your team to see uniforms, not people, he said, his voice steady, each word placed carefully. That is why this happened. And Daniel shook his head slightly, trying to recover ground that was already gone. You are making this bigger than it is, he replied. But even as he said it, his eyes flicked around the room, searching for agreement, for support, and finding none, because now the employees were not looking at Ethan like a problem. They were looking at him like an answer they had missed, and the distance between perception and reality was collapsing in real time. And Ethan took one more step forward, closing the space completely, not invading, not threatening, just present in a way that could not be ignored. No, he said quietly. You made it exactly what it is. And behind him another notification echoed, then another, the subtle sound of systems updating, of decisions being executed somewhere far above this lobby, but directly connected to it. And Olivia's phone buzzed in her hand, her eyes dropping to the screen as she read the subject line that had just appeared, her breath catching slightly as she looked back up, because now there was no doubt left, only consequence waiting to be spoken aloud. And in that moment, the building no longer felt like Daniel's domain. It felt like something else entirely, something that had already shifted ownership in more ways than one. And Ethan stood there, calm as ever, as if he had been waiting for this exact second from the moment he walked through the door. The silence did not just hold, it deepened, pressing down on every person in the lobby like a weight they could no longer ignore, because now the truth was no longer approaching. It was already here, unfolding in real time, and Daniel felt it in the way his name was no longer being said, in the way no one looked to him for direction anymore, his authority dissolving not with confrontation but with absence. And Ethan did not rush the moment. He let it breathe, let the room sit in what it had created, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, as if he had seen this exact unraveling before and knew there was no need to force it forward. Because once a system exposes itself, it finishes the job on its own. And across the lobby, phones began to light up one after another, soft vibrations echoing like a quiet alarm, not loud but constant, impossible to ignore. And Olivia's voice broke through again, steadier now, no longer questioning but reading. Executive notice, immediate review of all operational conduct, temporary suspension of management authority pending investigation. Her words slow, careful, as if saying, them too fast might make them unreal. But they were not unreal. They were happening, right now. And Daniel turned toward her, his face tightening. Stop reading that, he said. But it was not a command anymore. It was a reaction, and reactions always come too late. And Ethan watched without interrupting, without correcting, because this was not about proving a point. It was about revealing one. And another employee checked their phone. Then another, the same message appearing across screens. Identical, official, undeniable. And the shift in posture across the room was immediate, subtle but clear, shoulders straightening, eyes refocusing, not on Daniel, but on Ethan, because authority had moved, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, and Daniel took a step back without realizing it. A small movement that said more than anything he could have spoken, and for the first time since this began, he looked uncertain not just about Ethan, but about himself, about every decision he had made in the last 5 minutes, replaying them in his mind as if there was still time to undo them. But there was not, because moments like this do not rewind. They define, and Ethan finally spoke again, not raising his voice, not addressing the entire room. Just Daniel, direct and precise. You saw what you expected to see, he said, each word measured. And you acted on it without hesitation. And Daniel opened his mouth, searching for something that sounded like justification, like protocol, like anything that could restore structure to what had just collapsed. But nothing came out clean, nothing came out strong. Because even he could hear how it would sound now, and that awareness was louder than any argument. and in the background another notification echoed, followed by a soft chime from the building's internal system, the kind that usually went unnoticed, but not today, not now. And Olivia's screen refreshed in her hand, her eyes widening slightly as a second notice appeared beneath the first, more specific, more final, and she did not read it out loud this time. She did not need to, because everyone could feel what was coming next, the air shifting again, not with uncertainty now, but with inevitability, and Ethan glanced briefly around the room, not scanning, not judging, just acknowledging, as if marking the witnesses to something that would not be forgotten, before returning his focus to Daniel, his voice as steady as it had been from the start. "This is where it changes," he said, and for the first time since the moment began, there was no question left about who controlled what happened next. The moment did not explode. It settled, heavy and irreversible, like a verdict already written before anyone realized there was a trial. And Ethan stood there with the same calm presence that had carried him through every second of this encounter, his eyes steady on Daniel, who now looked less like a man in control and more like someone trying to understand how control had slipped away so completely without warning. And the room mirrored that confusion, employees shifting their stance, their attention no longer scattered but fixed, unified, as if they were all witnessing the same realization at the exact same time. And Ethan did not raise his voice when he spoke again. He did not need to, because the silence around him amplified every word. "Authority is not what you say in a room," he said slowly. "It is what the room accepts." And no one interrupted, no one laughed, because the room had already chosen. And Daniel's lips parted as if to respond. But nothing formed, nothing held. Because every defense he could reach for sounded smaller now, thinner, exposed under the weight of what had already been revealed. And behind him another chime echoed through the building's system, this one sharper, more distinct, the kind tied to access control, and several employees instinctively glanced toward their badges, toward the doors, toward the systems they had trusted without question just minutes ago. And Olivia's phone buzzed again, her eyes scanning quickly before she looked up, her voice steady but filled with a new kind of gravity. "Management access has been restricted effective immediately," she said, not reading for Daniel, not reading for the room, just stating what was already true. And Daniel turned slightly, almost instinctively reaching for his badge as if to confirm it, as if the physical object could still validate something that had already been revoked. And in that small movement the shift became undeniable, because power that has to be checked is power already lost. And Ethan took a single breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough to mark the transition from observation to decision. And for a brief second his gaze moved past Daniel, past the tension, to the people watching, the ones who had laughed, the ones who had stayed silent, the ones who had questioned. And in that glance there was no anger, only recognition, as if he understood exactly how systems like this sustained themselves, not through one voice but through many. And then his focus returned, sharp and final. "You told me to clean something," he said, his tone even. "So let us clean it properly." And the words did not sound like a joke. They did not sound like retaliation. They sounded like resolution, like something precise and inevitable. And Daniel shook his head slightly, almost reflexively. "This is not how this works," he muttered, but even he could hear the weakness in it, because nothing about this moment followed the rules he thought he understood. And Ethan stepped forward one last time, closing the space completely, not aggressively, not forcefully, just enough to make it clear that there was no distance left between decision and consequence. "It is now," he replied quietly, and somewhere in the background another system alert chimed, longer this time, followed by the faint click of a locked terminal resetting. And the room did not react with noise. It reacted with stillness, the kind that comes when everyone realizes they are standing inside a moment that will be talked about long after it ends. And Ethan did not rush to finish it. He let it land, let it settle, because real authority does not chase attention, it commands outcome. And the outcome had already begun. The air did not move, it held its breath, as if the building itself understood that something final was about to be spoken, something that could not be reversed once it left Ethan's mouth. And he did not rush it. He let the silence stretch just long enough for every person in the room to feel the weight of their own role in what had just happened. The laughter, the silence, the assumptions, all of it settling into place like pieces of a structure now fully visible. And Daniel stood at the center of that realization, no longer leading, no longer directing, just present, his posture stiff, his eyes searching for something that would restore balance. But there was nothing left to hold on to, and Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm, precise, carrying across the room without effort. Effective immediately, all supervisory authority under your name is revoked, he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly, like a fact that had already been processed before it was announced. And a soft chime followed his words almost instantly, the system confirming what he had just declared, and Daniel's hand moved again toward his badge, slower this time, as if he already knew what it would tell him. And when he pressed it against the reader, beside the nearby office door, the light did not turn green. It stayed red, steady, unchanging, and that single detail said more than anything else could have, because systems do not hesitate. They do not argue. They simply reflect the truth of who holds control, and right now that truth had shifted completely, and a low murmur moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, just a collective acknowledgement that what they were witnessing was real, that this was not a misunderstanding or a temporary escalation. This was a full reversal, and Ethan did not look at the badge reader. He did not need confirmation from machines. He had already made the decision, and his focus remained on Daniel, steady, unwavering. You enforced a standard based on appearance, he continued, each word deliberate. And you did it without verification, without hesitation, and without accountability. And Daniel opened his mouth, finally finding his voice, but it came out uneven, uncertain. We were following protocol, he said, but even as he said it, the words felt hollow, exposed, because protocol without judgment is just a shield for bias, and everyone in the room could hear it now, could feel the difference between what had been claimed and what had actually happened. And Ethan took a small step back, not retreating, just creating space, as if to show that this was no longer personal. This was structural. Then your protocol is broken, he said simply, and that sentence landed heavier than anything before it, because it did not just address Daniel, it addressed the entire system behind him, the culture, the habits, the silent agreements that had allowed this moment to exist in the first place. And across the room more phones buzzed, more screens lit up, confirmations spreading faster now, emails, system alerts, internal notices all aligning with what Ethan had just spoken, and Olivia looked down at her screen again, her voice steady as she read the latest update. Termination review initiated for involved personnel, and this time no one told her to stop, no one tried to interrupt, because the room had already accepted what was happening, and Ethan let the words settle, let the system continue its work, because real authority does not need to repeat itself, it simply executes. And as he stood there, calm and composed, it was clear to everyone watching that this was never about a restroom, never about a task. It was about a system that had just been exposed and a man who had decided, in a matter of minutes, exactly how it would change. The shift was no longer subtle. It was complete, settling over the room like a new order everyone could feel, but no one had yet fully processed, and Ethan did not rush to fill the silence. He let it stretch, let every notification, every locked badge, every unread email do the work for him, because systems speak louder than people when they are aligned. And right now, everything in this building was aligning behind him. And Daniel stood there with his hand still near his badge, as if holding it. Close could somehow return what had already been taken, his eyes moving from Ethan to the employees, searching for familiarity, for loyalty, for anything that looked like support, but all he found were faces turned away from him, not hostile, not confrontational, just distant, as if the role he had occupied seconds ago no longer existed in their minds, and that absence was louder than any accusation. And Ethan finally moved again, not forward this time, but slightly to the side, opening the space between them, creating a line of sight that included everyone watching, because this was no longer a private exchange, it was a moment of accountability witnessed in real time, and his voice carried without effort, steady and clear. This is not about one instruction, he said, his tone even. It is about a pattern. And the word pattern landed differently, heavier, because it implied repetition, history, something deeper than a single mistake. and a few employees shifted uncomfortably, their eyes dropping for a moment before lifting again, because they recognized it, even if they had never named it before. And Ethan continued, "You saw someone you assumed had no authority, and you acted accordingly." And Daniel shook his head, quieter now, less certain. "That is not what happened," he said, but the denial did not hold. It did not reach anyone beyond himself, because the evidence was still echoing through the room in the form of notifications, in the form of locked systems, in the form of silence that refused to support him. And Olivia stepped slightly forward again, not boldly, not dramatically, just enough to be part of the moment, her voice steady as she spoke. "There are 3 prior complaints logged under your name," she said, reading from her screen. Similar descriptions, similar assumptions, and the words did not accuse, they confirmed. And Daniel's expression shifted again, not to anger, not to defiance, but to something closer to realization, the kind that comes too late to change anything. And Ethan did not interrupt her, did not correct or emphasize. He simply let the information exist, because truth does not need reinforcement when it stands on its own. And across the room the atmosphere changed once more, not tense now, not uncertain, but settled, like a decision had already been made. Collectively, even without a vote. And Ethan turned his attention back to Daniel, his gaze calm, unwavering. "Leadership is tested in the moments no one thinks matter," he said quietly. "And you failed that test the second you decided who I was without asking." And there was no anger in his voice, no satisfaction either, just clarity, the kind that closes a chapter without needing to raise its volume. And Daniel did not respond this time. He did not try to argue or justify, because there was nothing left to say that would change what had already been revealed. And Ethan let the silence return one last time, not as tension, but as closure, the kind that signals the end of one structure and the beginning of another. And as another soft system chime echoed through the lobby, confirming yet another internal update, it became clear to everyone present that this moment was not just about what had happened, it was about what would never be allowed to happen again. The room did not move forward. It paused, suspended in that rare space between consequence and understanding, where everything that had just unfolded began to echo backward through memory. And Ethan felt it too, not in the room, but within himself, a quiet shift that pulled him out of the present for just a moment, not to escape it, but to measure it against something older, something deeper. And for a split second the polished marble floors and glass walls faded into something else, something far less refined. A narrow hallway in a building that smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and old carpet, where a younger version of him stood holding a resume that no one had read, being told politely but firmly that he should use the service entrance next time, that it would be more appropriate. And back then he had nodded, not because he agreed, but because he understood something even then, that arguing in moments like that did not change the system, it only exhausted you, and that memory did not bring anger now. It brought precision, because every step he had taken since then had been built on one decision, to never allow someone else's assumptions to define his position again. And now here he was, standing in a building he owned, being told once more where he belonged. And the difference was not just in power, it was in response, because this time he did not have to walk away. This time he could stay, observe, and change it. And as the present came back into focus, the room reassembled around him. The same faces, the same silence, but now layered with something else, awareness. And Ethan let that awareness settle before he spoke again, his voice softer than before, but carrying just as far. "This is not new," he said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating something that felt larger than the moment itself. And a few people shifted, not out of discomfort, but recognition, because they could hear the truth in it, even if they had never experienced it the same way. And Ethan continued, "What is new is what happens next." And that line did not sound like a warning. It sounded like a transition, like the point where something familiar ends and something unfamiliar begins. And Daniel looked up at him again, slower this time, his expression no longer defensive, no longer searching for control, but trying to understand what he had missed, what he had overlooked in those first few seconds that now felt like hours ago. And Ethan did not rush to answer that unspoken question. He simply let it exist, because understanding is not given, it is realized. And across the room, Olivia lowered her phone slightly, her posture no longer tense, but attentive, as if she was witnessing something she would carry long after this moment ended. And another employee took a quiet step forward, not to speak, not to intervene, just to stand closer, as if proximity to the truth mattered. And Ethan looked around once more, not scanning for reactions, but acknowledging the shift, the subtle but undeniable change in how the room held itself. And then his focus returned, steady, grounded, as he spoke one more time. "We are not fixing a moment," he said. "We are fixing what allowed it." And that sentence settled deeper than anything before it, because it reached beyond the individuals, beyond the immediate consequences, into something structural, something lasting. And the room did not react with sound. It reacted with stillness, the kind that signals understanding beginning to take root. And in that stillness, it became clear that what had started as a single command had transformed into something much larger, a turning point that would not be undone, not because of force, but because of clarity. And Ethan stood at the center of it, not as someone who had proven a point, but as someone who had changed the conditions entirely. The moment had already shifted from confrontation to control, but Ethan did not treat it like a victory. He treated it like a process, and processes required structure, not emotion. And as he stood there, the room now fully aligned in attention, he reached into his pocket once more, not hurried, not dramatic, just deliberate, and pulled out his phone again, his thumb moving with quiet precision as he reopened the line that had never truly gone inactive. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm authority that had reshaped the room minutes earlier. "Initiate full cultural compliance audit," he said, each word clear, measured. "I want every department reviewed, every complaint reopened, every unresolved case brought back to the surface." And on the other end, there was no hesitation, only confirmation. "Understood, Mr. Cole. Audit teams are already being assembled." And that response did not surprise him, because this was not improvisation. This was design, a system built to respond the moment it was activated, and now it was moving, quietly but completely. And across the lobby, the weight of those words settled differently than anything before, because this was no longer about one manager, one instruction, or one moment. This was about everything connected to it, everything that had been overlooked, ignored, or dismissed. And Daniel felt it immediately, his shoulders lowering slightly, not in surrender but in recognition, because he understood now that what had just begun would not stop with him. And Ethan turned slightly, just enough to address the room without raising his voice. "Accountability is not selective," he said, his tone even. "It does not stop where it becomes uncomfortable." And a few employees exchanged glances, not defensive, not resistant, but reflective, because they could see themselves somewhere in that statement, whether through silence, compliance, or participation. And that realization was quieter, but no less powerful than anything that had happened so far. And Olivia stepped forward again, this time with more certainty, her voice steady as she spoke. "There are already emails going out to all departments," she said, looking down briefly at her screen before back up. "Mandatory review sessions, policy reevaluation, leadership accountability measures." And Ethan gave a slight nod, not approving, not praising, just acknowledging that the system was doing exactly what it was meant to do. And he shifted his gaze back to Daniel, not with judgment, but with finality. "This is where responsibility becomes real," he said quietly. And Daniel did not respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that anything he said now would not change what had already been set in motion. And around them the room held steady, not tense, not chaotic, but transformed, as if everyone present could feel that they were no longer standing in the same environment they had walked into earlier that day, because something fundamental had changed, something deeper than policy or authority, something rooted in awareness. And Ethan let that awareness settle one more time before speaking again, softer now, but no less precise. "What you allow once becomes what you allow always," he said. And that line did not land like a warning. It landed like a truth that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. And as another quiet wave of notifications moved through the room, confirming the expansion of the audit, the reach of the changes, it became clear that this moment was no longer contained within these walls. It was extending outward, through systems, through departments, through every level of the organization, and Ethan stood at the center of it, not as someone reacting to disrespect, but as someone restructuring the foundation that had made it possible in the first place. The room no longer felt like a place where something was happening. It felt like a place where something had already been decided, and everyone inside it was simply catching up to that reality in real time. And Ethan stood there without urgency, without pressure, as if time itself had slowed to match. The clarity of the moment, because when control is absolute, there is no need to rush. And he let the final layer of silence settle before he spoke again, his voice calm, steady, carrying a weight that did not need volume to be understood. "There is a difference between a mistake and a mindset," he said, his eyes moving briefly across the room before returning to Daniel. "And what happened here was not a mistake." And the words landed clean, without accusation, without emotion, just truth, placed exactly where it needed to be. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible but heavy, as if he had been holding something in place that could no longer be maintained, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, just still, because stillness was all that remained when control was gone. And Ethan continued, not to press, not to escalate, but to conclude. "You did not ask who I was, you decided who I was," he said, each word deliberate. "And then you acted on that decision, like it was fact, and no one interrupted, no one shifted, because the entire room understood that this was not just about one person anymore. It was about a pattern that had been named and could no longer hide behind routine or assumption." And Ethan took a small step back, creating space not out of distance but out of completion, as if the center of the moment no longer needed to be occupied. "That is what ends today," he said, and the sentence did not sound like a threat, it sounded like a boundary, something firm, something permanent. And across the room the final wave of notifications began to appear, not scattered this time, but synchronized. Emails marked urgent, system updates confirmed, internal memos delivered with precise timing. And Olivia looked down once more, her voice steady but unmistakably certain as she spoke. "Termination actions have been approved and executed," she said. And this time she did not need to read names. She did not need to clarify, because everyone already knew who that included. And Daniel closed his eyes briefly, not in resistance, not in denial, but in acceptance, because the process had already moved beyond him. And when he opened them again, he did not look at Ethan first. He looked at the room, at the people who had once taken direction from him. And in that glance there was no longer authority, only recognition of what had been lost. And Ethan watched without interruption, without commentary, because this was not a moment that required explanation. It required understanding. And as the final system chime echoed through the lobby, longer than the others, more definitive, it marked the end of something that had been in place long before today. And Ethan turned slightly, not away, not dismissive, just ready, as if the work here was complete, his voice quiet, but clear as he spoke one last time into the space. "We do not correct people by raising our voices," he said. "We correct systems by changing their outcomes." And with that, the moment closed, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with something far more lasting. A shift that could not be undone because it had already been executed in every place that mattered. The room did not return to normal. It could not, because something fundamental had been removed and replaced at the same time, like a structure taken down and rebuilt without anyone leaving their place. And Ethan stood there for a moment longer, not because he needed to, but because moments like this deserved to be fully seen, fully understood, not rushed past as if they were just another corporate decision. And the employees felt it, the weight of what had just happened settling into something quieter, something more reflective, as conversations did not resume, as no one reached for their phones out of habit, because this was no longer a space for distraction. It was a space for awareness, and Daniel remained where he was, not frozen, not resisting, just present in a way he had not been before, as if for the first time he was seeing the environment around him without the filter of authority, without the assumption that his position defined the outcome. And Ethan finally shifted his posture slightly, not turning away completely, just enough to signal that the moment of direct confrontation had passed, his voice returning, calm and measured, but now carrying something different, not correction, but direction. This does not end with removal, he said, addressing the room as much as the system behind it. It continues with responsibility. And that line landed in a different way, not heavy, not sharp, but grounding, like something meant to be carried forward rather than reacted to. And Olivia nodded almost instinctively, her expression no longer uncertain, but focused, as if she understood her role and what came next, and a few others followed that shift, their posture changing subtly, no longer spectators, but participants in whatever this new structure would become. And Ethan continued, his tone steady. Every person here will be reviewed based on action, not assumption, he said. And every outcome will reflect that standard. And no one questioned it, no one challenged it, because the credibility of those words had already been established, not through volume, but through execution. And in the background the system continued to move, quieter now, more refined, like a machine that had already completed its primary function and was now calibrating for what came next. And Ethan glanced once more across the room, not searching, not evaluating, just acknowledging, because leadership at this point was not about control, it was about clarity. And then his attention returned forward, his voice lowering slightly, but remaining clear. What happened here will not be erased, he said. It will be documented, understood, and used. And that statement did not feel like a warning. It felt like a commitment, something that ensured this moment would not disappear into routine, that it would instead become part of the foundation moving forward. And Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, not out of shame alone, but out of recognition, because even in loss there was something to understand, something that could not be ignored anymore. And the room held that understanding together, not unified in experience, but unified in awareness. And Ethan took one final step back, not exiting, not disengaging, just repositioning himself within the space he had just redefined. And in that movement it became clear that this was no longer about him standing at the center. It was about the system now standing on something stronger than before. And as the last quiet notification echoed through the lobby, signaling the completion of the immediate actions, the room did not react with relief. It reacted with stillness, the kind that comes when people realize they are not returning to what was, but stepping into what has already begun to change. The lobby did not return to its former rhythm. It transformed into something quieter, more deliberate, as if every person inside it understood that what had just happened was not an interruption but a reset. And Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but intention, because endings like this required clarity, not speed. And he allowed the silence to settle fully before taking a slow step forward, not toward anyone in particular, but into the space itself, reclaiming it in a way that did not need to be announced. And his voice followed, calm and steady, carrying across the room without effort. This company will not be defined by moments like this, he said. It will be defined by what we choose to correct after them. And the words did not sound like policy. They sounded like direction, something that moved beyond the immediate and into what would shape everything that followed. And the employees listened, not because they were required to, but because they understood that this was no longer a routine statement. It was a line being drawn in real time. And Olivia stood a little straighter, her phone lowered now, no longer a tool for confirmation, but a reminder of what had just unfolded. And a few others mirrored that shift, their attention no longer uncertain, but focused, as if they were stepping into roles that had not been clearly defined until now. And Ethan continued, his tone unchanged, but his words carrying a deeper weight. Respect is not something you assign based on appearance, he said. It is something you extend without condition. And that sentence settled into the room like a foundation, something solid, something that would not move once it was set. And Daniel remained silent, his presence no longer central, but still part of the moment, because even in consequence there was a role to play, one that did not require words, only understanding. And Ethan glanced briefly in his direction, not with judgment, not with dismissal, but with acknowledgement, as if recognizing that even this outcome had a purpose beyond the immediate. And then his focus returned to the room, his voice lowering slightly, but remaining clear. Every system reflects the people who run it, he said. And today we made that reflection visible. And the statement did not land as criticism. It landed as truth, something that could not be ignored now that it had been seen so clearly. And across the lobby, the atmosphere shifted again, not tense, not uncertain, but grounded, like a space that had been recalibrated to something more stable. And Ethan took one final step back, not retreating, but completing his place within the moment, as if everything that needed to be said had now been said. And the system behind him continued its quiet work, not loudly, not visibly, but consistently, reinforcing the changes that had already been set in motion. And as the last of the notifications faded and the room settled into its new state, it became clear that this was not just an ending. It was a standard, something that would remain long after this moment passed, because what had been exposed could not be unseen, and what had been corrected could not be undone. The room did not erupt into applause or conversation. It remained still, grounded in something deeper than reaction, because what had just taken place was not meant to entertain. It was meant to be understood, and Ethan stood there one last time, not as a figure above the room, but as a presence within it, his posture relaxed, his expression calm, as if the outcome had never been in doubt, only the timing. And he let his gaze move slowly across the faces in front of him, not searching for approval, not measuring response, but acknowledging the shift that had already taken hold, because this was no longer about proving anything. It was about what remained after the proof. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, but it carried further, as if the room itself was listening more closely now. Power is not in being recognized, he said, each word deliberate. It is in being consistent, even when no one thinks you matter. And the sentence settled into the space with a kind of permanence that did not need repetition, and a few people lowered their eyes, not in shame, but in reflection, because they could see themselves somewhere in what he had just said, whether in action or in silence. And Ethan continued, not to extend the moment, but to close it with clarity. You did not know who I was, he said, his tone even. But you showed me exactly who you were. And there was no accusation in it, no bitterness, just truth delivered without distortion. And that truth did not divide the room. It unified it in awareness, because everyone present had witnessed the same moment, felt the same shift, and understood, at least in part, what it meant. And Ethan took a slow breath, not out of relief, but completion, as if the weight of the moment had been fully placed where it belonged. And then he added one final line, not louder, not sharper, but unmistakably clear. Respect is not something you wait to give, he said. It is something you decide to carry. And with that, he turned slightly, not walking away from the room, but moving forward within it, as if the space itself had changed direction, and the employees did not stop him, did not follow him. They simply watched, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of understanding, because what they had just witnessed was not a confrontation. It was a standard being set, and as the lobby remained quiet, steady, and undeniably different from what it had been before, it became clear that this moment would not fade. It would remain, not as a story of what happened, but as a reminder of what should never happen again. And Ethan did not look back, because he did not need to. The change was already behind him, and it was already holding